This is a syndicated feature of the American Broadcasting Company.
The soldier's welfare is always the business of commanders of all grades. The Allied soldier faced all the hardship and danger of ordinary battle, while the elements made his daily life almost unendurable.
General Eisenhower's understanding of what the GI went through was thorough and sound, an understanding confirmed by the GIs themselves.
Yeah, the general really hit it on the nose. They can talk all they want about the more glamorous branches of the service winning the war. But the guy who got the dirty end of the deal, in Italy especially, was a plain GI. Right, Louis?
Check. You know, before we went into Italy, I thought the Nazis were our only enemy, but the weather was just as tough. And after a while, it was the routine of the same old rations and no chance to sleep that started to get me.
I thought I'd never get back to the States. Never have a meal again that didn't come out of a ration can.
It was perfectly good food, of course, but after a while it began to taste pretty terrible, especially during those months of cold, damp weather when a good meal would have done wonders. The weather turned from bad to worse, and from worse to lousy. It depressed everybody, including the general.
American soldiers frequently referred, in terms of sarcastic disgust, to sunny Italy. Heavy rains fell and the streams were habitually torrents. Men and vehicles sank in the mud.
The war itself was pretty rugged. All the guys I know, who were in 3 or 4 campaigns, pick Italy as the toughest one of the bunch. The enemy wasn't kidding. Every mile we advanced in Italy was won after a stiff fight. And we took quite a beating doing it. It began to look as though the Germans didn't particularly want us in Italy. The terrain was terrible. That kind of country was much tougher on the guys who were advancing. That was us. Than on the guys who sat in the mountains and took pot shots at us.
We'd capture one mountain, and there'd be another one right in front of us. I used to dream about Nebraska and that nice flat land.
But the dream never lasted long. They really let us have it. Times when those rocks came in handy. Somehow you never had the feeling that you were down deep enough. After a while, you got so mad that you were actually glad when the moment came to move up and start pouring it on the enemy. We used everything we had. Rifles, BARs, and mortars.
In temporary stalemates, there always exists the problem of maintaining morale among fighting men while they are suffering losses. Among green troops, the problem is much more serious than among veterans. The attitude of the latter was well expressed in a remark made to me one day by a sergeant. General, he said, on the map, this job looked easy, but now the Heinies seem to have something to say about it. But there's nothing wrong with us that a good, rousing victory won't cure. There is an old expression, the nakedness of the battlefield. It is descriptive and full of meaning for anyone who has seen a battle. The feeling that pervades the forward areas is loneliness. There is little to be seen. Friend and foe, as well as the engines of war, seem to disappear from sight when troops are deployed for a fight. Loss of control and cohesion are easy because each man feels himself so much alone, and each is prey to the human fear and terror that to move or show himself may result in instant death. Here is where confidence in leaders, a feeling of comradeship and trust in them pays off. The trained American possesses qualities that are almost unique. Because of his initiative and resourcefulness, he becomes, when he has attained a proficiency in all the normal techniques of battle, a most formidable soldier.
The routine was the same, over and over. Up out of a hole and move forward fast, so the enemy couldn't draw a bead on you too accurately. Then down into another hole. Sometimes you couldn't get rid of the feeling that this time might be your last. But after the enemy pulled out, there you were, still alive. It was quite a kick, moving up to take over the territory we fought for so hard. Each town we moved into seemed a little closer to Berlin and the end of the war. We didn't fight all the time, although it usually seemed that way to us.
The effect of prolonged combat is always bad. If a unit is brought out of line before the processes of physical and mental fatigue have gone too far, it can be ready for re-entry into battle far sooner than one that has been kept in line too long. Moreover, the periodic rests for the frontline soldier have a splendid effect upon morale. And in any kind of warfare, troop morale is always a decisive factor. An immediate visit along the entire battlefront convinced me again of the soundness of our view that winter operations in Italy would be accompanied by the utmost hardship and difficulty. I felt that maintenance of morale would require careful control of operations and the best efforts of all commanders. Certainly, I intended to be close by to help. My visits to the front were, in addition, the occasion for serious discussion of problems involving particularly replacements, ammunition, clothing and equipment for winter weather, and future plans. Nothing can take the place of direct contact between commanders.
We weren't pulled out of the lines very often, but when we were, we made the most of it. It was quite a luxury to be really clean again, and it was relaxing, just shooting the breeze and knowing that a shell wouldn't be landing on top of you any second. After we took Naples, the first beer was issued since the Italian campaign began. It was brewed right in Naples itself by an American officer who remembered the formula from back in the States. To the GIs who were lucky enough to be on the spot when the first issue was distributed, the beer tasted 1,000 times better than it ever did in Chicago or Savannah. But for every lucky soldier who got beer in Italy, there were a lot more who didn't know there was any beer to be had in the whole country. When somebody in the area had a radio, we'd tune in Command Performance, a program from the States that answered GI's requests.
We feel we could win the war single-handed if we could only hear Carol Landis sigh. Okay, fellas, don't forget your promise. Carol Landis will now sigh.
guys who'd looked at tourist folders about sunny Italy back in the States before the war never expected to find themselves up to their ears in snow. It was hard enough moving our heavy weapons around in that terrain, but the snow made fighting a war almost impossible. Farther back, conditions were just as bad. The roads were treacherous. Transportation was slowed down to a walk. The men were pretty well toughened up, but living in the ground in that area for any length of time meant a sure trip to the medics. Besides pneumonia, there were skin diseases to worry about. Frostbite and trench foot were common. The commander started worrying about our combat strength being cut down.
Because of the miserable conditions along the front, we began to suffer a high percentage of non-battle casualties. Trench foot was one of the principal causes. Cure is difficult, sometimes almost impossible.
If it was a bad case, it was pretty painful. And even with regular treatment, it was tough to get rid of. While you had trench foot, you weren't much of an asset to your outfit as a fighting man. A large number of non-battle casualties could tie up a unit just as much as if they'd been shot to ribbons by the Germans. All through the Italian campaign, we hit areas that were heavily mined. To explode them, we used all the latest gadgets. A mine flail attached to a tank was pretty good at routing them out on flat country. That way, there wasn't a chance of anybody getting hurt. But we couldn't use this trick invention everywhere. In most places, the first part of the job, locating the mines, was done by our old reliable mine detectors. The next step was the really ticklish one. Getting the mine out of its hole and making it harmless took a lot of patience and a steady hand. But it saved many GIs' lives. One of the trickiest of the enemy's traps was the German shoe mine. The case was all wood, and the detonator was plastic, so it didn't register on our mine detectors, which reacted only to metal. To feel out the enemy's positions, to learn where he was weak and where strong, we went on a great many patrols. For the soldier who wanted a chance to see the enemy face to face, this was the ideal group for him to be with. Sometimes we had to walk for miles before reaching territory which might still be in the hands of the enemy. You could never be sure, of course, that some innocent-looking field wasn't full of Nazis, all set to take a shot at you. Even though nothing was moving besides the men in the patrol, you could usually sense it when you were in doubtful territory. From then on, all that training you had in basic came in very handy. All those hours spent on creeping and crawling and generally making yourself a poor target were paying off. Any building was always a possible nest of snipers. Usually it was a good idea, if possible, to approach a building from two sides at once. A few grenades sometimes did the trick, but you could never be sure. Each new patch of ground and each new building might present a tougher problem. You could never be too alert. Every now and then, one of the men got it. It might look as though the Nazis had pulled out, but you could never count on it. But the enemy machines we destroyed by shell fire were good signposts along the route of the Nazis' withdrawal. It grew pretty clear that the enemy was gone. Usually you could expect them to leave behind some souvenirs, always with a good, strong charge attached. No matter how fast they pulled out, the Nazis seemed to find time to booby-trap the place from top to bottom. But they weren't fooling us very much anymore as we moved on up the Italian peninsula. We got a lot of dope on the Nazis from the natives of the towns we moved in on. Most of them were glad to tell us everything they knew about the Germans. Sometimes their tips were pretty valuable. Most of our information on what the enemy was up to and what his plans were came from the Nazis themselves, the ones we'd captured. The success of our patrols depended not so much on the number of Nazis we killed, but on capturing some alive and bringing them back to our forward command post. We didn't bother to try to get any information out of them ourselves. Our job was simply to get them back without letting them out from under our rifles, without giving them a chance to pull any funny stuff. Back at the CP, they were questioned separately. At first, they said no to everything. But after a while, the intelligence officer got some of them loosened up to the point where they'd talk. Every now and then, we'd get some information that would really help us in planning attacks against exposed points in the German positions. Any significant stuff, we'd relay back to division headquarters, to our rear. Just to be on the safe side, we'd include some of the prisoners' statements which didn't make sense to us, but might to the men at division. They had the overall picture. All this information, true and phony, which we learned from the prisoners, got a high priority at division. In nothing flat, it would get a good going over by intelligence officers and checked with other late dope they had on the enemy. This would all be worked into a revised map of the enemy's strength in our area and would mean a lot to the brass when they decided where to hit the Nazis next. Then, not much later, we'd be moving up again, ready to plaster the enemy some more and push him back farther and farther, till he finally had enough.
In the combat regions, a visitor was invariably inspired by the capacity of the Allied soldier to perform his duty quietly and efficiently, enduring hardship and privation and hourly facing danger with a determination and confidence, often even a cockiness that seemed never to deserve.
This is a syndicated feature of the American Broadcasting Company.